Once again, this is Lita Downs from the Office of Teaching and Learning Excellence, and I will be your moderator today during our College of Management and Human Potential virtual symposium sessions. Today, we have Dr. Miguel Messina, and he will be presenting on his study, Failed Dependency, Leadership Strategies to Prevent, Mitigate, and Heal Organizational Trauma in Behavioral Health Systems. At this point, I would like to turn things over to Dr. Messina. Welcome. It's great to have you on the phone today.
Thank you so much, Lydia. Good afternoon, or good morning for me, but good afternoon for the rest of you guys in the Central. I'm in the Pacific Northwest, so for me, it's morning still. My name is Miguel Messina. I happen to be my history with Walden. I completed 2 years of a fellow where I learned a lot about research and presenting and teaching. And I have been a contributing faculty since February of this year. So I'm very pleased to be here on this organization. And before we get started with the presentation, I just want to let you guys know that this presentation is based on my graduate dissertation for my doctorate. And it was inspired based on my own sort of experiences in the behavioral health field. I have worked for this field now about 23 years. And I have completed a multitude of positions, both in clinical practice, teaching, and in leadership, most of all. And I have a few battle scars to show as I have tried to sustain my career in this very challenging sort of a field. So that's the basis for my research. And the research that I'm showing you is the research that I conducted. And I would run, it's a very high level, and I would run swiftly through it. I would like to leave time at the end to either talk about the research or talk about the concepts of organizational trauma, which is the main topic for the research. Next slide, please. The purpose of the study was to conduct a modified Delphi technique to discover a consensus of opinion of a nationwide experts in the behavioral health field. So the modified Delphi study is conducted when true accounts for conceptual definitions are missing in a particular discipline such as organizational trauma. So I decided to do the Delphi to capture the consensus of professionals that are actually working in the field and for them to help me arrive to some concepts and some definitions. These professionals possess personal and professional experiences that constitute informed opinion regarding the role of leadership and the potential for organizational trauma in a community-based behavioral health organization, which was my main focus. I have spent most of my career working for community-based behavioral health organizations. Next slide, please. The importance of the study, it is essential because in the behavioral health organizations, leaders lack the training and the expertise and understand traumatization of systems. However, they can begin to learn the process of how to mitigate and heal and prevent if their approach to action within their organizations. There is an opportunity to create leadership training and development programs specifically for professionals in the behavioral health industries. Historically, they advance to managerial and leadership positions due to the effectiveness of clinicians and social services professionals. Again, this is based on experience. I got promoted to several positions as I was ongoing on my career. In every position that I was promoted to, I lacked the ability and the expertise and the skills to fulfill my role in that particular position. So it was more like trial by error, having to work and learning what the position is about. But I did get moved up because I was a very good clinician. So that's what is meant by this point. Next slide, please. Identification of the gap. As any good research, I needed to identify where the gap existed within the literature. And I know that a lot of practitioners and scholars have studied organizational trauma in a lot of different industries with a particular traumatic event. And here's where I'm going to provide some explanation. I created a Venn diagram, which provided me an interception of the phenomenon of organizational trauma, combined with the behavioral health systems, which is what I chose to, which is my primary field, and which the literature show a gap, and the leadership styles or the leadership work was what allowed me to emerge to the gap. So what I talk about trauma and the causes of trauma can be several. So I encourage the group to think about what possibly can cause an adverse situation or a traumatic situation within an organization, particularly behavioral health organizations. And I give you a clue, such as natural disasters. And for example, what we just experienced the last 3 years, which was the COVID-19 process. But I want you to understand that my focus in the study was to recognize that perverse, unskilled leadership mismanages or ignores the impact of organizational change and other internal and external factors that directly affect employees and the organizational culture. So my focus is in what causes the trauma. I postulated that the lack of skills within leadership at the level of our behavioral health organizations can actually create the trauma or allow the trauma for it to happen. Next slide, please. The research questions are 3. I first wanted to sort of demonstrate that the existing definitions of organizational trauma or organizational trauma as it exists in other organizations can be mimicked in the behavioral health organization. So in other words, I wanted to be able to find out if people in the behavioral health organizations were able to identify with organizational trauma definitions. The second question regards to leadership, and it was arriving to a consensus by the expert panel in the process of leadership as a strategy to mitigate, prevent, and heal organizational trauma. So in other words, in the second question, I'm making responsible leaders for defining the organizational trauma and other adverse events, and also to take responsibility in healing the process in the behavioral health organizations. And 3, equally by the consensus of opinions from the National Panel of Behavioral Health Experts, was to try to understand what are the training needs for leaders in order to leaders to be able to be ready to mitigate adversity and traumatic events in an organization. Next slide, please. The methodology, I already spoke a little bit about it, which is a Delphi method. Usually draws opinions from participants' experiences. It talks about the wisdom of the crowd. Again, when there is a lack of definitions of a particular topic, you can rely on people who work on that environment or who live in that environment, and via questions and a process of interview, sort of gather their consensus or their opinions based on the life and professional experiences. This method is very important because it guards against the influence of a specific group members. So nobody's manipulating the discussion, more like a T group or a facilitating group interview. Nobody's manipulating the group discussion, and no outside factors might influence their opinion. So each expert is on his own or her own to be able to answer to the questions of the interview. And of course, importantly, emphasizes confidentiality, anonymity, and the autonomy of the responses. Next slide, please. The design, I took in consideration some factors in trying to organize the people who participated in the study. The first one was individuals that work actively in the behavioral health field, work as clinicians and leaders. The method provided flexibility and an opportunity to review the questions and feedback. But I want you guys to remember that the leaders, as I create an expertise of these professionals, I consider them leaders and practitioners in the behavioral health field. The panel received a list of the most current literature review. So every section of the interview process, they first receive a page describing the event or describing the set of questions by the current and most knowable information known in the literature currently for organizational trauma. It was important for me that created some diversity. So I have participants from 9 different states. Again, I included 2 different roles, which is leadership and practitioners. I require for them to have a minimum of 5 years of experiences working in the field and a minimum of a master's degree in education. I was trying to create that expertise profile and that ability for them to participate in the study and to understand the concepts and the rigor of the Delphi methodology. Next slide, please. Thank you. And the data sources, I originally tried to recruit 26 individuals were invited to participate in the study. Out of the 26 individuals, 18 replied with willingness to participate in the study. And they themselves identified as meeting the qualifications of expert. The study itself, as defined by a Delphi study, it requires to do at least 3 rounds of questionnaires. And these questionnaires were divided by 3 categories. And the categories were, I already mentioned some of these, the categories were the existence of organizational trauma, the roles of leaders, and the training and development of leaders for the behavioral health organizations. Next slide, please. The collection of the data took place via SurveyMonkey, and both the 3 rounds of interactions were collected by SurveyMonkey. As already mentioned at the beginning of each round of questionnaires, that there has to be a consent to participate in the study, and the experts have to agree to their expertise in order to participate in the study. And they receive a paragraph of information, rather informing them of the most current information based on the literature review and the questions that they were consenting about. Next slide, please. The statements were used in the first round were directly from the literature review because we didn't have any consensus at the first round. It was brand new. The second round included a consensus from the first round, the feedback from the experts, as well as material from the literature review. And the third round included a consensus from the second round, the opinions expressed by the experts, and more of the literature review. And as you can tell, I was trying to sort of increase the density of the material that they needed to consent about in each round of the questionnaire. So in other words, each round of the questionnaires, it got more difficult for them to have to process. In the first round of questionnaire, we aimed for 40% of accuracy. In the second round of questionnaire, we aimed for 50% of consensus. And the third round of questionnaire, we looked for 60% of consensus. And again, I was just trying to increase the difficulty in managing the consensus and the material that was presented from round of questions. Next slide, please. Just briefly, I want to tell you what the rounds included. The first round included 7 statements. Out of those 7 statements, each person needed to choose 3. And then those 3 for each person was aggregated. There was also space for open-ended sections where they can include their own thoughts about the questions that were asked in round 1. The same process took place in second round, but the statements increased to 10, and they were responsible for choosing 7 under each question, as well as an open-ended section to enter additional statements. And for the 10th round was a consensus and the accumulation of the first, second, and third round as the final consensus arrived. Next slide, please. Analyzing the data, even though that the study is a qualitative study, it required quantitative measures because we were using percentages to aggregate the statements and the meeting the threshold. I also use a flow chart that allow for the participants to see where their answers were following either for the next session or they were falling off the consensus. It is important for the participants to see where the answers are following through within the process. Next slide, please. Quickly in the results, I wanted to share with you that from the 18 participants, 15 answered the first round for a total of 83% of our participation. And the second round were 16 participants for a total of 88.88% of participation. And in the third round were 17 participants for a total of 94.44% and the third round of participation. For this being a Delphi study that is usually known for the drop to have a high drop-off rate, I think 15, 16, and 17, we were able to increase the participation of the experts as the study moved forward. Again, we received 86% of consensus in the first round. In the second round, we received 93.75 consensus. And the third round, we received 100% consensus of all the material presented, which is a high response rate for a Delphi study. So I was very pleased with the participation of the experts. The answers were grouped in each category, which I already mentioned the categories and the functionality within each category. Next slide, please. The results, I want to bring you quickly through the results. Remember that there were 3 categories: organizational trauma, leadership roles, and the training development. So within the organizational trauma, there was a strong consensus after the 3 rounds that validates the presence of organizational trauma in behavioral health organizations. What I'm trying to say, in other words, is that the experts were able to recognize that there is such a phenomenon as organizational trauma within the behavioral health field, even though that the language is misplaced. They were not using necessarily an organizational trauma language, but they were able to connect with the factors. They were also able to connect that organizational trauma leads to personal trauma if it is not properly mitigated or healed in the process. And it has potential to be cumulative and entrenches in the culture of the organization. And you will notice this. I mean, we always have known this by, you hear comments of people saying, I will never work for that organization, or this organization don't care from the people. That's when the adverse situation and the dramatic events already have entrenched the culture of the organization, and it creates interpersonal conflicts. They also agree that formal intervention and acknowledgement is necessary. Next slide, please. The highest rating of the symptoms of organizational trauma, this is very interesting and I'm very passionate about, is the collusion, groupthink, and scapegoating of key staff members. It is important because as staff members within the organization, once there is a presence of trauma or adversity, they begin to sort of attack each other, and they attack each other by means of collusion, groupthink, and scapegoating from each other, which is also what we were talking about a couple of slides back about the interpersonal conflicts within employees within the organization. Also, not only the organization suffers adversity, but their place within the community and the reputation with the community suffers. The adversity, they agree that the adversity comes by hands of organizational change, as well as internal and external shifts in conditions that create unnecessary stress. You know, you need to think about organizational trauma or adversity. What causes it? And we already talked briefly about some of those things, but you can summarize them in internal and external factors. Some of the internal factors can be considered sort of a group layoff, closing programs, of the death of a particular leader. External shifts can be considered COVID-19, natural disasters, or change in the sociopolitical and economic factors that presses upon an organization. Next slide, please. Regarding the leadership roles, it was agreed by the experts that leaders in organizations are responsible for managing the changes, transition, and predict potential events that can rupture the protective membranes of an organization. And the leaders have the opportunity to initiate the process of adaptation while working through the changes and taking responsibility and acknowledge for potential harm, which is, we work the opposite. We first encourage people to make the changes, and then we try to mitigate the reaction of the causes of the changes. So we have a process of reactionary rather than responsive. At the same time, the organizations are creating changes. Next slide, please. It is important to use transparency and trustworthiness in the communication. So leaders have to have already earned the trustworthiness of their staff, of the organization. And resiliency, defined as the ability to motivate and guide individuals towards post-traumatic growth. So the goal is, as identified by the experts, is not only to kind of go through the adversity, but to grow from the adversity and to position the agency to be a learning organization and can create a post-traumatic growth for the organization itself. And what it does, it just makes the organization stronger. Next slide, please. Now, regarding the leadership training topics, it was identified that transformational leadership has the most positive attributes associated with the leadership styles that rate the high in the consensus process. So the experts were able to say that in order to understand traumatic events, it requires listening, motivating, and engaging with others, and considered essential for a leader. And the best leadership style that provides these skills is transformational leadership. Next slide, please. There was also identified that it's important to connect the staff work, mission, and vision of the organization. In the behavioral health industry, it is recognized that a lot of the staff members that work in this industry have themselves suffer of adversity of one way or another, possible trauma of one way or another. And that's what creates a calling to work in this industry. So most people that works in the behavioral health industry have a personal mission. It is very important for leaders in order to create a resilient and post-traumatic growth organization that they connect the mission and vision of the leaders and the staff to the mission and vision of the organization. Obviously, leaders have to be prepared in understanding that possible adversity might take place in the organization. They need to be trauma informed. Next slide, please. And I believe this is the last slide in regarding the results. And okay, again, I talked a little bit about this. Leaders, when they're not prepared, they can have the same deleterious signs and symptoms as the rest of the staff of the organization. You see, even though that I'm making the leaders responsible, number one, for creating the trauma. Number two, I'm making the leaders responsible for mitigating the trauma. Number three, I'm understanding that the leaders are part of the organization. So leaders themselves are suffering collusion, scapegoating, and groupthink mentality that affects their functionality. They also experience in themselves the effects of the adverse situation or possible trauma that they're suffering themselves. They are staff within the organization and they're part of the culture of the organization. So it is challenging for leaders to be able to prevent the perversity and the toxicity if they're not taking care of themselves. And that's also why it's important to talk about leadership training and development, because it teaches leaders to be able to being self-care and to be able to mitigate not only their signs and symptoms of traumatic adversity, but also those of their staff members. And they have to develop an attitude that teaches them to learn during difficult times. Next slide, please. Regarding findings, that is a very long process, but I'm going to define it, or I'm going to summarize it by this paragraph. The findings of previous research inform of the importance of addressing organizational trauma in order to maintain a healthy, competitive organization that includes a supportive and resilient culture with healthy climate where employees function to their best capacities. What this paragraph is trying to say that behavioral health organizations are not set in stone, are not fixed organizations. They're actually living entities that fluctuate with a lot of different influence, internal and external. But also behavioral health organizations within a community are competitive within each other. They compete for resources, they compete for clients, and they compete for the care that they provide to the clients. So an organization has to address organizational trauma in order to remain healthy, competitive, and resilient among the groups of other agencies within the same community. There is, much like in any other organization, there is a competitive factor amongst behavioral health organizations. That's why they have different expertise. Some of them provide mental health, some of them provide different types of social services, some of them provide substance use disorder treatment, and so on and so forth. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next. May I have next slide, please?
It's progressing on my end, so I don't know if it's maybe
frozen on mine.
Let's go back because we're looking at findings and then organizational trauma assumptions.
Keep moving forward, please.
Signs and symptoms of traumatic systems.
Move forward, please.
Research question number one.
Move forward, please. Move forward, please.
Practical methods in preventing, mitigating, and healing organizational trauma.
Move forward, please.
Then research question two.
Move forward, please. To the next section, please.
Limitations.
There you go. Yes, thank you so much. I want to just offer a summary of the findings because it will take me a long time to go through the rest of the details on the findings. This study, like any study, has some limitations, and the number one limitation is the conceptual framework for this discipline continues to emerge and continues to be fabricated. There are some very strong definitions about what organizational trauma is, but the construct continues to be worked on and emerge. So without a strong construct, it's very difficult to study organizational trauma from organization to organization to organization to organization, which is a possible studies for the future. We also learned by the limitations that the actual study, I didn't have a mechanism in which I can attest that the experts actually knew the information. I didn't do a pre and post test, which is something that I learned after I finished the study. I should have done a pre and post test and see how well people learn more information about organizational trauma as the study was being conducted. I didn't do that. So whoever follows with this study will be important to do a pre and post test in order to learn that. Next slide, please. Future research, we have to understand organizational trauma at the systemic level. Usually behavioral health organizations places the responsibility of adversity to the people who provide the services. And that is a mistake, because the people who provide the services need to be equipped with their own empathy and their own emotional well-being. When you place these responsibilities to the people who provide the services, there's a shift, which is very dangerous. It's a shift where, for example, a counselor or a clinician, a therapist, or a social worker, they begin to turn their energies towards mitigating their own stress and their own adversity and how they're responding to their own stress and their own adversity, rather than to use those energies to provide the services that the client needs. Hence, there is a decay in the services provided, which is contradictory to what you want to do in a behavioral health organization. Understanding the technical skills and how to intervene in different industries. I talked a little bit about that. There has some research taking place in different organizations. I'm trying to include one of the organizations as behavioral health agencies, but there has to be a particular set of skills that can be observed by individual sort of industries. And understanding the events that negative impact a systemic process structure of an organization, those erode the fabric. We talked a little bit about this, the internal and external shift in processes. For example, COVID-19 created an important shift from in-person services, which was characterized by people coming and receiving services, either group therapy, individual therapy, or meeting with the social workers, their psychiatrists, their counselors, and it turned into a hybrid process where people were meeting virtually with the use of Zoom. And agencies that were able to shift and pivot swiftly to a hybrid model, where agencies that were able to sort of transcend the COVID shutdowns that we had for close to the last 3 years. Other agencies have a very difficult time sort of shifting from that process to mitigate the external factors. So that COVID is a good example that brings to a potential tragedy of organizational trauma within the behavioral health industry. Next slide, please. Implication for practice is important for organizations to adopt the organizational trauma and traumatization language within the strategic plan and the health of the organization. I have worked in several behavioral health organizations and have looked at many strategic plans within the organization, and none of those plans position the organization to mitigate or prevent adversity, which is, I think, an error. Regarding to leadership roles, we have the implication for practices is that leaders can prevent and mitigate traumas and adversity as it happens in an organization. And in trauma is recognized as responsible for healing and creating the post-traumatic growth process. Next slide, please. And my conclusions is that this research project was successful. I think it was successful in positioning behavioral health organization within the scope of organizational trauma as one more of the industries that are at risk of experiencing organizational trauma. And it makes sense. I mean, we work with people by people, and people are prone to traumatic events and tragedies. I think I was able to accomplish the connection between the phenomenon of organizational trauma and the role that leaders play in developing strategies to mitigate within an organization. And I think I was also successful in having organizations absorb the knowledge regarding the adversity and traumatic events and how well the well-being of an organization and culture impacts the performances of an organization and their staff. I mentioned that in a few slides back, in how without mitigation of adversity and organizational trauma, the results are poor services at the level of the community. And that was my presentation. I feel like I rushed a little bit. I wanted to leave a few minutes for questions regarding the study or for questions regarding the topic of organizational trauma, if anybody has any. And then there's 3 pages of references if you want to further investigate a little bit into this topic. And thank you.
If you have any questions, you can please just enter them in the chat, or you can also unmute yourself. We've got a round of applause from Dr. Harris. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Harris.
Any questions or comments for Dr. Messina?
Lydia, a quick question. Are we going to be able to get some PowerPoints that we like, or some sessions that we have and we'll be able to get the PowerPoints?
Absolutely. You can go back to the main site and they will be uploading the recordings of the sessions. And I believe you can reach out to the various presenters to get copies of their PowerPoints. They may be placed on the site as well. I do not know that for sure, but definitely the recordings will be.
Sure. I just want to tell the audience that I'm more than happy to, if anybody wants to reach out and learn a little bit more about this topic, I'm happy to share literature, not only the presentation, but I'm happy to share literature or my own dissertation if you're interested in that kind of stuff.
Fantastic. And Dr. Messina, I'm going to put your email in the chat. It's miguel.messina. Is there a number after your name?
No.
At mail.waldenu.edu. Fantastic.
There's a question here that I want to answer real quick. It says, do you have any suggestions of what organizations can offer to help employees with trauma? The first thing that it needs to be identified is at the level of the employee. If an employee is already experiencing a personal trauma, that needs to allow the employee to mitigate those sources. An EAP can be helpful on that, but what is more helpful is to have the supervisors identify that the person is experiencing a trauma and hence mitigate their work. It is important to understand how the trauma is affecting the employee. What type of clients can you see at this time that you're experiencing this situation? If somebody's going from a very difficult divorce, perhaps they are not feeling very well about seeing couples in therapy. So that's something that I will try to mitigate and not let that person do couples therapy. I will have that person do other types of therapy as they're working through those struggles. That's, for example, an example of how you can mitigate individual trauma in an organization. Audrey.
Great question. Well, if we don't have any further questions, we want to thank you all for attending today. It was great to have you on the line. And thanks so much, Dr. Messina. It was wonderful learning more about your study that you conducted